Mayday and distress calls are a daily occurrence for Coast Guard agencies around the world, but unfortunately many of them aren't legitimate. This can endanger the lives of people calling real distress calls, as resource may be in use in areas that it isn't needed. So let's look at some hoax Mayday and distress callers who were caught. Two teenage boys were in hot water with the FCC, the Coast Guard and their parents, who faced a possible $250,000 fine plus costs in the summer of 1996. The Coast Guard in Atlantic City, New Jersey was plagued with phony distress calls on the Maritime Emergency Channel. What was worse is that the two boys were actually jamming real distress calls. They kept their activity short and intermittent, which made the transmissions harder to trace, but the FCC rose to the challenge, and precise direction finders in the area soon closed in on the source of the transmissions. A boat docked at the rear of a residence was home to the marine transceiver, which was tested and found to match with the ID of the false distress calls. This information, together with the tapes of the calls, were reviewed with the parents and their children. Confronted with the volume of evidence, the boys soon confessed. In addition to the $250,000 fine, the kids faced up to 6 years in prison, but instead, miraculously, charges were dropped. More than 95% of all distress calls received during this time turned out to be false, but most were allegedly caused by unskilled personnel and careless handling, not malice. One Coast Guard station received 959 false calls in 1995 alone. A 24-year-old man from New Bedford, Massachusetts made a false Mayday call to the Coast Guard in February of 1993 and soon came to regret it. The Coast Guard picked up his call, in which he said, quote, I'm abandoning ship, I'm taking on water and I'm losing my boat, I'm going over, I'm losing my crew. A helicopter and 2 vessels were dispatched in search of the non-existent sinking ship, but later learned that the man had made the transmissions from aboard a trawler tied up in Nantucket Harbour. He was actually the first person to receive a jail sentence under the Studs Act and was sentenced to 3 months in jail. He was also ordered to pay $2,534 in restitution for Coast Guard expenses. The Studs Act, named after Gary Studs, was prompted by a 1990 tragedy in which William Hoaxer and his 14-year-old son died in the freezing waters off Martha's Vineyard. Coast Guard officials received Hoaxer's distress call but decided not to dispatch help when they received a simultaneous Mayday in which laughter was heard in the background. Back in the summer of 1995, the FCC's Tampa, Florida field office had to use direction finding techniques to track down a hoax caller transmitting false distress calls that had started sporadically in early April. St. Petersburg Coast Guard reported receiving suspicious calls for help on Marine Channel 16 and notified the FCC, who eventually homed in on an unlikely suspect, a 12-year-old boy calling from his father's boat on a trailer in their yard. The radio was unlicensed, which subjected the owner to additional fines on top of the maximum penalty for transmitting false distress calls, which was 6 years imprisonment, a $5,000 fine and liability for all costs incurred by the Coast Guard that were related to the incident. A man from Near Bay, Washington, led US and Canadian Coast Guards on a wild goose chase back in April of 1991. He broadcast a call for help, saying that his vessel was sinking, and repeated these transmissions for over an hour, leading to both US and Canadian forces being deployed. The FCC managed to find him, and he was ordered to pay $17,000 in restitution after pleading guilty to falsely transmitting a distress call. Restitution was divided between the two countries, with the US Coast Guard receiving $6,783 and the Canadians receiving $10,305. As you'll be already aware, sending a hoax distress call is a felony, and at that time in 1991 was punishable by up to 6 years in prison, a criminal fine of up to $250,000 and a $5,000 civil fine. And lastly, in April of 1996, a Mayday rang out from the rough Atlantic waters off the coast of Massachusetts. As always, the Coast Guard responded, launching rescuers from Boston, Gloucester and Air Station Cape Cod. The problem was that the Mayday was a fake, and after an exhaustive search to be sure, crews headed home. Now this is the interesting bit. Later that day, police heard a man bragging on his CB about making a false distress call. The man, an 18-year-old living at home with his parents, wasn't arrested, but Coast Guard officials paid him a visit to explain that sending false distress signals was a violation of federal law and that charges were possible. Why he wasn't charged isn't clear.